Mr. Stadelmann, you can start.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the whole team here for organizing the International Symposium on Economic Thought. My name is David Stadelmann. I'm a professor for economics at the University of Bayreuth in Germany currently, and I'm affiliated to numerous other international institutions or research institutions. And it's a true pleasure for me to present here some thoughts, actually a small paper and an upcoming book project actually that we are working on. And the presentation, as you can see, is entitled Market Failure on the Market for Political Services, a Basic Evaluation Framework. And what I want to do with you is I want to get your attention for 15 to 20 minutes, and I hope to give you some interesting insight. Nothing will be totally new, but I think putting it together in this way of what market failure in the market for politics could be quite interesting. And the first question that I ask, or that I think we should ask, is: do we actually need government? And the answer is, of course, yes. We need government because there is usually some type of market failure in all markets. We know 3 types of market failure. Sometimes in textbooks you read 4 types of market failure, but one is certainly monopoly power. So we need government intervention there. Asymmetric information is a reason for the breakdown of normal markets, and of course externalities are a fundamental problem in normal markets. Sometimes in standard textbooks you also read public goods. I haven't listed public goods here because according to my view it's some sort of a combination between externalities and monopoly power. Take climate change, for example, as a type of externality. If we are talking about climate protection, it would be some type of a public good. So there you can see the externality is related to the public good. If you think about infrastructure, then this is sometimes conceived as a public good, but often it's just a type of monopoly. Say, we do not necessarily want to have the railway tracks in private hands by a private company, because, oh, well, that would be some monopoly power, thus it may be better to have it in the hands of the government or of a controlled company, and then ask that company to provide the services essentially for free, so in sort of a public good, but then get some tax revenue in return for that. In any case, it's clear that there are countless examples of market failure. Thus, market failure is ubiquitous. So we need government. But the central question is not whether we need government or not, but we are economists. So the actual question must be, how much government do we need? And that's quite unclear if you think about it. So it's not so evident to answer that question. And there are 2 reasons for that. One reason is that the solution of market failure does not necessarily require government. Because we have self-healing processes of market failure. Sometimes innovation helps to overcome different types of market failure. Competition may help to overcome monopolies, and innovation also may help to overcome monopolies. So there are self-healing processes of market failure. And there is institutional healing. So institutional healing in the sense, if we have certain rules, such as competition regulation, or property rights, they help us to overcome certain elements of market failure. So we do not necessarily need government intervention directly. So it's unclear how much government we really need. And if we perform a comparative analysis, then we have to realize that it's not only market failure that exists, but also government failure exists. And quite often, government failure is quite tremendous, if you think about it. So it's very unclear how much government we actually need. And there is, of course, if you look at the literature on what I've just said regarding market failure and also regarding government intervention, there's a huge literature. The literature is really vast, and I can't go into all of it. So I'm trying to present it in a quite simple way because I want to make certain conclusions. So I just let the literature run for you through. But it's clear, actually, that when we, as economists, are thinking about government failure, we do not mean something like that, what you see here. We do not mean that some type of investment project can go awry, can fail, or that you have some other mistakes that are made by government. If you draw connections to the current crisis, government failure is not necessarily that we currently do not have enough vaccines. That's not necessarily a government failure. The government failure would be rather prior to that, with the question, why weren't we able to prepare well for such crisis? Why weren't we able to gain information on the actual willingness to pay of consumers for vaccines prior to having them, so that we know how much we want to spend? So it's not what you see here on the slides, what I mean by government failure, that there are sometimes things going wrong. That happens to all of us. But I mean it in a more structural way. And I would argue that government failure is just market failure in the market for politics. We should conceptualize, when we are thinking about government, we should conceptualize government and politics as a market. Politics in representative democracies can be understood as a market. It's the market for political services. Politicians, administrators, etc., they provide political services. And there are demanders for political services too. Voters demand political services. There are special interest groups that demand political services, etc. Political services themselves include the provision of public goods, regulation, subsidies, industrial or environmental policies. But there is a market, and there's of course competition on that market for political services. Politicians among each other compete to provide political services. And then of course interest groups, voters, and other societal organizational groups compete or have a demand for these services. So we should try to analyze government failure not as something going wrong, but rather structurally as market failure in the market for politics. And I want to show you that I think that this is very revealing and allows us to gain a lot of insights from the existing literature already to understand government failure better. And I would start with the three types of market failure that we have in normal markets. We can simply and directly apply them to government. A central failure in the market for politics, a central explanation for government failure is monopoly power. Every government, by construction already, has some type of monopoly power, often a substantial degree of monopoly power. Now, it's quite clear if you think about it, that if monopoly power of government would be totally unconstrained, most likely we would have some huge problems. We would call that, dictatorship. And usually most dictatorships do not perform do not perform well. So we need competition in the market for politics. In democracies, the power of politicians is constrained by re-election prospects. We have diverse checks and balances to constrain monopoly power. So we have independent courts, if it works well. We have auditors, state auditors. We have diverse ways of reducing the monopoly power of government in order to avoid the monopoly power of government or to reduce it, and then bring politics closer to those who demand the political services, and for those, in this case, who are actually the principals of politicians, and that would be voters, citizens. So monopoly power is clearly one reason for failure in the market for politics. We also have asymmetric information in the market for politics, if you think about it. Quite clear. Politicians do not only try to maximize some kind of social welfare of citizens. Rather, they have problems. They have their own interests. And often, as agents, they do something different than what their principal wants. And the problem is that campaign promises are simply not binding. And you don't have perfect contracts that can be written with politicians. Voters cannot directly observe everything that politicians do. And of course, politicians do not necessarily know what voters want, a typical asymmetric information problem. And of course, also the administrators do not necessarily know what politicians want, and they do not know what voters want. You have different groups, then automatically some people try to solve part of this asymmetric information problem in the market for politics. And you get interest groups, pressure groups, special interest groups. What they try to do is they try to find out what their members want. They can do that. Usually they are small and they have very focused interests, and they try to communicate that in the political process. That's good for them. That's also good for politicians, because at least there is some information exchange. So the information asymmetry to some extent is reduced. But then, of course, that's at the expense of voters again, because voters have difficulties to organize, and there is also rational ignorance. It doesn't pay a lot to be well informed as a voter about what's actually happening, because I don't have a lot of influence. In general, asymmetric information is a huge problem in the market for politics. That's why politics is not performing that well as it could. And finally, we have externalities. And now you might think, well, it's quite clear actually that there is monopoly power in the market for politics, that there is asymmetric information in the market for politics. But what are externalities? Because in a sense, the idea of politics is to solve the problems of externalities through some type of conditional cooperation that is imposed by, well, some monopoly power actually. But then again, if you think a bit further, externalities are the essence of all political decisions. Political decisions produce externalities almost by their nature, because they are usually made for a group of people, for a nation, say, or for a region. So it means the decisions affect everybody, but not necessarily everybody agrees with the decision. So you have, in some sort, a type of externality. Some people are paying for the decision, so they are financing the public good that is produced, but they do not necessarily benefit from it. So that's a type of externality that we accept, that the political process is generating this externality. However, it's still a problem, because it may be that the decision makers, the beneficiaries, and those who pay for the public services, that they are not the same group. And well, then you run into certain problems. So externalities are the essence for market failure in the market for politics. What can we do? Well, we could try to find mechanisms to constrain the monopoly power. That's then the whole discussion in large literature on, well, how to introduce more competition, what the effects of competition in politics are, etc. To reduce asymmetric information, we may think about fostering mechanisms for transparency, and externalities can be dealt with cost transparency. So to inform about all the costs that political decisions entail and the welfare losses. I would go a bit further. If you think about solutions for market failure in politics, I think we have two fundamental approaches. The first is foster competition, and the second is institutional congruence. And by institutional congruence, I mean bringing decision makers as close together with those who are paying, and those who are paying should also be roughly the same group as those who benefit from the political services that are provided. How can this be achieved? The problem is that competition and institutional congruence, they do not emerge automatically in the political process. So in some sort, it must be also a collective decision itself to implement them or to try to foster competition and institutional congruence. And I would argue there are several ways for fostering competition. And we can think about fostering competition between politicians. That would be representative democracy or something like representative democracy. That's the idea. You have competition between different politicians for office. But there is more than that. You also need competition between ideas. That would be something like more direct democracy, where citizens formulate initiatives that they introduce in the political process, where they also have the property rights on these ideas. So we need competition between jurisdictions through decentralization. Why? Again, this reduces the monopoly power of national government, and at the same time, decentralization provides information to citizens, because you have yardstick competition that can then happen. So I can check here whether my region is performing better than the neighboring region. If there are different policies that influence you, you get through decentralization some sort of competition. Of course, you have problems then at the same time, because that's then you may introduce tax competition for fixed resources, so that can also generate new externalities. Evidently, you want competition between countries too. That would be openness. That's why most economists tend to be relatively pro-openness, not meaning that openness can't have negative effects, but as a principle rather. And of course, you need competition between powers. That would be refined checks and balances. So competition is central in the market for politics in order to bring the supplier of politics, the suppliers of politics, that would be the politicians, closer to the demanders of politics, closer to the principles, which would be voters in this case. And secondly, also institutional congruence doesn't emerge automatically. Here we need mechanisms to foster full cost transparency. I want to give an example. Take public transport as an example. We know that cars generate externalities, environmental externalities, accidents, etc. So one solution, what some people say is, oh, public transport should be subsidized, because private transport is generating externalities. But of course, public transport is also generating externalities. but not externalities in the sense of accidents or fewer accidents at least, and less environmental pollution, but it's generating other types of externalities, mainly budgetary externalities. Somebody has to pay for the public transport through by tax money quite often, because you need subsidies usually for public transport. It's not running on its own, which then means that somebody else is actually paying for the services that certain people receive, mostly in cities. So a clear externality problem, and only through full cost transparency, by not only looking at costs of environmental pollution, accident, but also by looking at all the budgetary costs that are incurred, we can achieve some institutional congruence. So altogether, it means the market for politics will not through itself generate competition and institutional congruence. But here it's us as economists and looking at economic thought, of course, to where we have to think, how can we in practice also generate this competition and institutional congruence. I think, to conclude, collective decisions are made by people, and people react on incentives. So government is a form of collective decision. Institutions define the basic rules of the game and thereby set the framework for our interactions. And I would understand politics as a market, as the market for political services. In functioning democracies, a large part of political services aims actually at curing certain market failures that commonly occur. However, viewing politics itself as a market highlights that the market for political services also suffers itself from market failure. And that's due to monopoly power, asymmetric information, and externalities. And I think systematically applying this type of economic thinking, that politics is just like another market, helps us to find new solutions in order to overcome this market problem. And I would like to thank you very much again for the great organization, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Professor Stadelmann, congratulations and thank you for your interesting and successful and informing presentation. And I want you to wait a couple of seconds for checking some questions, if any we have, please.
There is no question. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Stadelmann, we have no questions about your.
Okay.